Alrighty. Welcome back, YouTube. Welcome to Truth Over Tea. I'm excited today to talk to my atheist friend Calvin here, who has been so gracious as to join to have a conversation just about his experience becoming an atheist, and then discussions between what we believe as either a theist or an atheist. So welcome, Calvin. Why don't you tell the crowd a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate you having me on. It's always a fun time hopping on other people's shows and spreading the word. I like helping other people out with their content creation. But yeah, man, my name is Calvin.
Thanks,
I go
man.
by Unquestionable Calvin on most social media platforms. So I mean, if anyone wants to search me up on anything, I usually can just throw Unquestionable in front of Calvin. That's me. Um, yeah, I guess a little bit about me is, I mean, obviously I'm an atheist. I don't believe in any god or gods. I take the agnostic position on that. So I'm not claiming that there is no God. I just lack a belief in a God, just like someone would lack a belief in Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster or something like that. Yeah, I guess my kind of upbringing is I grew up in a Christian household. It was a Baptist household, and yeah, it was never like super heavily enforced. We went to church pretty regularly until I was like almost 10 years old. And then my parents split up, and my mom, just being a single mom, couldn't bring me to church as often as she needed or wanted to, at least. Um, so both my older sisters are baptized. I'm not baptized. Neither is my younger brother. So yeah, it just kind of was on the back burner. Like, Jesus is always watching. My grandma was very religious, but we never really sat down and talked about it before she eventually passed away earlier this year. And
Mm,
yeah, but I cleaned on a lot to conspiracy theories, if anything, like flat Earth,
okay.
aliens running the government, that kind of pretty kooky stuff I started to get into, Bigfoot's an interdimensional time traveler, that kind of stuff.
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy stuff. And that's kind of like more so my upbringing is my sisters kind of indoctrinated me into that, like a lot of superstition. There's a lot of Native American lineage in my family. So a lot of superstitions regarding, like Cherokee legends and stuff like that. So a lot of that more so at the forefront. Ancient Aliens was my Bible, if anything.
Mm,
And yeah, it started to get pretty serious around my late teens, around 18, 19, 20. I started to get really heavy into it, and that's when the kind of crazier, you could even consider dangerous conspiracy theories started. Like we never went to the moon. I know something you don't know type of thing. Like, UFOs are alien technology. Ancient lost high technology. Atlantis exists. It started to get pretty serious. I was writing blogs about alien species that I didn't even know that if they exist or not, but I was writing like 6 or 7 page like articles on alien
wow.
species and stuff. And that was called Project Unknown Blogs. That's what I did like initially as my first like outreach. Then I realized I couldn't get what I wanted down on paper. And like as far as thoughts go, I wasn't getting like the outreach that I wanted, the views, the likes, etc. So I thought I would switch to an audio platform. So that's when I decided I'm going to start up a podcast. And so I started up my podcast, Unquestionable with Calvin Smith, and that's where the Unquestionable Calvin comes from. And it more so was supposed to be a show talking about like aliens, UFOs, that type of stuff, conspiratorial kind of podcast, talking about those, breaking those down. And as I started to talk about them more and research them more in depth, I started to get a little bit more skeptical about them. So I kind of started to interview more people in that realm, and I started to kind of hear this echo chamber, like of the things that I'm saying, but it's coming from other people that I in some cases look up to, some pretty high profile people in those realms of conspiracy theories, that people that are on Ancient Aliens and the Gaia network and stuff. And I started to talk to them and think, why do I think they sound crazy? Like, why why do I think they sound crazy, but when I say it, it doesn't sound as crazy? But it's the same thing. So it kind of was like, if you listen to the podcast from episode 1 to episode, like I think it was like 40 or 45 or something, is where I ended. I don't do it anymore. I've stopped doing it for about a year and a half now.
Oh,
You can
okay.
hear my deconstruction process. Like it gets a little bit less confirmation bias as the conversations go on. Like, instead of me agreeing with everybody like I do at the beginning of the show, by the end of the show, I'm like, I don't, I have you on my show, and like, I like what you're saying and stuff, but I just don't, same thing that I would do with a Christian is that like, I just don't believe that type of thing. So yeah, I kind of, from talking to people in that realm, it kind of helped me to deconstruct from those beliefs. And now let me say that the Christianity belief left probably when I was 16, 17 is around the time that I would say that I would say that I'm not Christian anymore. And it wasn't until I was like probably 22, 23 that I openly said that I was atheist. But I still believed in these conspiracy theories and I advocated for them. But since then, it's been probably 2 or 3 years since I've deconstructed from a lot of the conspiracy theories. A lot of them are still in there that I'm still, you still dig yourself out of some that you don't know are deep down in there. And yeah, it's kind of what I do. I talk to people about what they believe and why they believe it. That was the premise of my show, is that I didn't try to like tell anyone they were wrong or anything. I just had them come on, plead their case type of thing. And yeah, that's what I like to try to do on TikTok. I'll do TikTok lives and talk to people about what they believe and why they believe it. I do some nonprofit work here in Southeast Michigan for some for the Secular Alliance of Michigan and Michigan Atheists. They're pretty large atheist organizations here in Southeast Michigan. And I take this big sign that's behind me. It says "Ask an Atheist." And I go to a busy park and I'll set up kind of like, it's street epistemology. If anyone isn't aware what street,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, that's what I'll do is I'll take the sign and I'll stand out there, maybe with some pamphlets that like explain what atheism is, something that I can't get out like right there in public. I'll give you a pamphlet or something to take home with you. Yeah, and just talk to people out on the street like that on behalf of a nonprofit. But I'm looking to kind of step away from doing it on behalf of a nonprofit and just kind of doing it in my own time. And I do live stream those events too. Whenever I do them, I live stream them on TikTok so people can actually interact while I do that as well. But that's pretty much
While you're
about
in
me.
public, you're live
Yeah.
streaming?
Yeah,
Okay.
live stream in public there. I'll just set the camera up just like this right in front of me with the sign behind me, and people can be on camera and talk to me, or they don't have to be, and they can stay completely anonymous if they want.
Is it kind of
Um,
like the who was that guy? Steven Crowder used to do
yeah,
that louder change my mind thing.
yeah,
Is it like that?
exactly.
Okay.
That's pretty much, I mean, kind of in like that's kind of what he's doing, but it's much more aggressive. And street epistemology is like kind of the opposite. It's not about like debating or like winning debates or anything. It's just about having a cordial conversation. And like bottom line is you want to be able to shake hands at the end of the conversation and walk away from it, cool.
Okay, gotcha. I'm thinking more like literally the table and the binder, and
Yeah, no, I
okay.
literally it's just me and the sign. I take
Okay.
me and the sign out there. There's no table or nothing, just people walking by. I'm like, hey, they see what the sign says. It says ask an atheist. They don't have to stop if they don't want to. They can just keep walking. I'm not yelling at people. I'm not telling
Okay.
them they have to stop or anything. Yeah, it's a fun time.
Okay. That I'd see, and I've watched some of your stuff, and I've seen a couple of your live streams before on TikTok. I didn't know you were into the conspiracy theory, like
Oh yeah.
aliens, and I've never gone down that rabbit hole. I've gone down the flat Earth rabbit hole a little bit,
Mhm.
but that just didn't. It just wasn't very convincing, so I was quickly out of it. But
Yeah.
that's interesting. So was was it those conspiracy theories or just like that world that pulled you away from Christianity? What was the disconnect there? What
So
happened there?
it's that's an interesting question, because actually the conspiracy theories, if anything, were actually kind of making my faith stronger at the time. Because at the time,
Okay.
a lot of the conspiracy theories I was looking into led back towards the Bible. Like, and so you could say, some verses in the Bible are advocating for a flat Earth, or you could say that they're advocating for alien. Jesus was an alien. Like that type of thing.
Yeah.
Dead Sea Scrolls. You could go down a whole rabbit hole with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so, Noah's flood, you can consider the whole flood in the Younger Dryas epoch and like Atlantis and stuff that kind of ties into the Bible and stuff. So it's like it all kind of led back towards the Bible. So I was looking at the conspiracy theories and saying, okay, the Bible is corroborating these things. And what happened is, as I started to become more skeptical of my belief in Christianity and the belief in the Bible, as I started to look more into these things, it started to weaken my faith in conspiracy theories the more I looked into the Bible. Because I looked in the Bible and I was thinking, if I'm this skeptical about my religious beliefs, about whether God exists or any certain events happen in the Bible, why am I not applying that same amount of skepticism to the conspiratorial beliefs that I'm, looking into? I'm just reading those on the surface and believing them. So it's, yeah, like I was looking into the conspiracy theories, which in some cases would lead me back towards the Bible. and then I would look into the Bible version of that, I guess you could say, and then go back to conspiracy. There's a lot of back and forth between the conspiracy theory and whatever the Bible says, or even other religions, like other religious ideologies, like even like Egyptian mythology and Incan and Mayan mythology, and a lot of Egypt mythology, if I'm being honest. Or so a lot of it was like a whole chain of events. Like Enoch is an alien. Like
Oh,
that's kind of my explanation. Is like, oh, it's easy. Jesus is just an alien, no problem.
okay.
Yeah.
So, how did you go from that to atheist as opposed to like maybe a deist or maybe a theist that's just not into the Abrahamic faiths or something like that?
Yeah, I guess bottom line is like I just don't see a reason to believe in any higher power, regardless of what name or, description, if you want to place Allah or Krishna, Yahweh, whatever name you want to label onto that. I don't see a reason to believe in this almighty omni being, I guess you could say. I don't have any reason to believe that now. If that's why I say the religious beliefs left first, because, I stopped believing in Christianity, stopped believing in like a universal creator, and started believing that, interdimensional beings that are not gods, they're just interdimensional
Okay.
beings, whatever you might describe them as. They created the universe, yada, yada, yada. So it kind of was like God of the gaps, but it's like aliens of the gaps.
Okay. I can see. Well, I mean, even like Richard Dawkins has
Mhm.
proposed panspermia before.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not like out of the realm of anything that's ever been suggested. So that,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Okay. Okay. So, really, it was you were born in Christianity. You became skeptical upon your conspiracy phase. And then
Mhm.
that kind of led you, and then it ultimately away from anything supernatural. So, would you call
Right.
yourself a naturalist?
I would say so. I would say
Okay.
so.
All right. So, because there are atheists that are like I don't know how much you get into philosophy, but especially in like epistemology and in ethics, you have a lot of or atheist philosophers that are what's called non-naturalists, and it's like Michael Humer. He's this atheist philosopher. He's really brilliant with his work in ethics, but he says he's a non-naturalist because he thinks there's a soul, but he's an atheist.
Mm.
So I was just curious if you held to like a position like that or something,
Yeah.
because I don't think I've met anybody in your position. Now, I will say most of the flat Earth people I've met, um, or the no dinosaurs existed people, most of them are Christians, or they claim to be Christians.
Yeah.
So
It's
I can
crazy that
see
those people are
the
out there still
intertwine there.
nowadays. It's just wild to me.
Well, the no dinosaurs exist thing, like flat Earth, I don't think it's true, but all right, you do you, I guess,
Right. Maybe they got some good math, whatever.
but
But
like there's just too many fossils that we found, and it just becomes are these all fake? I
exactly.
get Jurassic Park, the franchise made a lot of money, and that can be convincing to be some, but I mean, the initial phase of dinosaur finding started in the 19th century, in the mid
Right.
1800s, not 1993 or when Jurassic
Yep.
Park
And
came
that's
out.
just the documented dinosaurs. I mean, they've been finding them
Right.
for even longer than that and just thinking that they're dragons or something.
Dragons, right, right. And so that's that I've never that has just never I can't even like pretend like, oh, okay, I can see like that's just never. Anyways, um okay, so I get your story now. I kind of get where you've come from. So that's really interesting. You did a lot of podcasts, 46 episodes. So
Yeah,
that's
I did I think 46 episodes. There probably is closer to 50. There's actually that's the funny thing is that over my course of deconstruction doing the podcast, there's probably maybe 4 or 5 podcasts that are unpublished at this point. Like they were published for a year or two, and I've since taken them down because I'm just not that person anymore. It just totally misrepresents my position. Now, granted, there are still some
mm,
episodes that you can listen to that I'm a bit kooky on. Still believing in some pretty crazy stuff that nowadays I don't really believe, but it's not as forward as some of those other episodes that you know, I have one episode that I was talking about evidence for Atlantis that's like 6 hours long. I was talking into a
wow.
microphone for like 6 hours about evidence for Atlantis. I made like a whole slideshow. It probably is the most extravagant like podcast I ever made. I worked super hard on it for weeks, and I've since unpublished it. You can't even watch it anywhere anymore because it's just freaking crazy.
Wow. That's just
Yeah,
so much work to, I mean,
I know. I really was fighting for it. I didn't want to let it go. I held on to
yeah.
it for a very, very long time. The whole Atlantis exists thing.
Wow. I mean, I've struggled to like remove shorts that I've made that a 60-second video that
Yeah.
I now
Right.
disagree with. So 6 hours. I mean, that's a lot of
Yep.
work. Okay. So I guess from where I come from, I grew up as a Christian, but I kind of fell off as a teenager, got into drugs, partying and stuff. Um, uh, really just that was fun. I basically just wanted to do my own thing. I rebelled and then got into trouble and then found my way back to Christ. But it really didn't become like solid in my faith until I got older, and I actually like started getting into apologetics, and that's what like convinced me, okay, maybe it's not just faith, because I've seen some of the live streams that you've had before where you'll bring on Christians that just like, to be frank, they make a mockery of Christianity. Like if you're gonna go and debate somebody or you're gonna have a discussion, you have to have at least somewhat of a solid argument, a reason to believe what you believe, not
Right.
because the Bible says so or something. And I know you've had those conversations. I saw the one video you had too, where the Christians were heckling you at.
Mhm.
I guess that was the thing you were talking about, the
Yeah,
sign
I
thing.
was
Yeah,
doing standing out there with a sign, and these two guys approached me, and one of them wanted to talk to me for off camera, before I got the camera rolling or anything. He was talking to me for like 10-15 minutes while I'm setting up and stuff, and he was a cool guy. We were having a nice conversation about belief while I was setting up my stuff. It's no big deal. And then like once the camera got rolling, he sits off to the side and with his friend, and they heckle me for like an hour. Um, it- and jokes on them. I made a bunch of money off of them heckling me. So like, jokes on you, I guess. Like,
right.
but yeah, and it was just because I don't believe in the same thing as them. Bottom line is that um, they were mad that I'm there because there's a street. The whole reason why I set up where I do set up is because there is a street preacher that'll set up directly across the street from where I set up in all my videos. Right across the street, he sets up there. And when me and my wife moved to this town, um, we took a walk down there when we first moved here, and we saw this guy there with a soapbox and a giant sign that says, gays are going to burn, and, all that type of stuff. Giant sign, standing on a soapbox with his Bible and a megaphone, just going away. And I was like, if he can do that, why can't I do that? But set the example. So I started looking more into like street epistemology and working with nonprofits, and the Secular Alliance of Michigan helped me get the sign. They helped pay for it. And yeah, so I set up and kind of set the example. So instead of yelling at people with big signs and everything, I just kind of stand there. People can read the sign, and you can stop and talk if you want to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me ask then, that begs the question, have you ever heard any arguments that at least like make you think, or that are somewhat convincing, that may have made you think twice about where you stand, like in favor of theism?
Not really, honestly. I've at this point, I feel like there isn't an argument I haven't heard at this point, and none of them have really like resonated with me to where I'm like I have to rethink my entire worldview per se, and say oh wow, maybe there is a God. I haven't gotten that solid argument. I haven't gotten, and me, I'm a very evidential person. I would need solid, demonstrable, empirical evidence that a God exists. We can talk about philosophy all day. We can talk about philosophical arguments, but that's not evidence. At the end of the day, it's not evidence. It's just philosophy. So I would need something demonstrable, empirical, repeatable, to be able to warrant believing in any God.
Now, would you call yourself an empiricist?
Um, I've been asked that before. I think it's a slippery slope. I would If we have to put a pin down on it, I would probably say yes.
Okay. So I guess the problem I would have with empiricism is because the view is self-refuting. You may have heard this before, because you can't empirically verify empiricism. So
I guess so. I guess you're right.
right. So and this is why I got really into philosophy, because I started to realize I used to reason very badly. So and I used to just fallaciously think a lot. And that it's helped me really grow and understand why I believe what I believe. Studying epistemology and ontology has really changed just how I think about everything, not just God.
Yeah.
Um, so like for me, I would say what convinces me the most is the arguments for theism. Like I think it's more probable that there is a God. And when I say God, I mean a maximally great being, like the maximally great being theology. And then from there, that's why I think that Christianity is true, because there is a God, and it's more likely that miracles can happen if God exists, as opposed to like miracles happening with no God.
Okay. So what
Um,
makes you think that that particular God that you believe in, the Christian God, what makes you think that that one is real and not, the other God claims, like
sure.
Zoroastrianism or Hinduism or Islam or, whatever it may be? I mean, what convinces you of Christianity over these other religions that are, essentially in some cases would be claiming the same things, clinging to the same things that you may be clinging to or similar things?
Some of them, yeah. I think that monotheism is the most simple. So, like, if we're going to imply the principle of parsimony or Occam's razor, then simplicity is going to be better than something that's more complex that's not necessary. So, having like a polytheistic view, you don't need that. It's simpler to have one being that has the necessary attributes for existence. So that'll bring us down to essentially the monotheistic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. I think there are two big problems with Islam that would push me away from Islam. Number one is going to be that anything or most of the prophecies, all the prophecies in Islam, are actually self-serving to Muhammad, right? And they kind of like the Injil. That's a big problem for Islam. What is the Injil? It's this supposed gospel that's prophesying Muhammad that we don't have. So that's kind of problematic. It rejects the crucifixion, which is that's not a contested fact in history. Like ultimately, we're relying on old data that we have to say that it's a historical truth. But I think we have better reason to believe, even from a secular point of view, that the crucifixion happened, not the resurrection, just the crucifixion, as opposed to it not happening. And then, of course, if we're taking the Quran's word, this is something written 600 years after the event, as
Yeah.
opposed to we have documents far closer. So whenever there's self-serving prophecies, that makes me skeptical, because if God exists, is he that stupid? Like I can only have my prophets be self-revealing rather than being revealed in an earlier prophecy. And so that to me, and then of course a lot of their prophecies and work is self-serving. Oh, I can marry this many wives, kind of like Joseph Smith from Mormonism. And so that's kind of weird. And so that would be one thing to like kind of get Islam out of the way. Judaism, you're just kind of like battling between, is Jesus the Messiah or not? If
Mhm.
Jesus rose from the dead, then he's the Messiah. And I think that the arguments for the resurrection, it's more probable given the data than not. That's
Okay.
where I stand there.
Gotcha. I would disagree that it's not debated that the crucifixion happened. I think it's pretty heavily debated that the crucifixion happened. I personally don't think like that, like none of that happened. I don't really have a reason to believe that any of that happened, other than the Bible saying so. It doesn't really follow traditional, um, punishment practices of the time. A little bit here and there, but there's some things that don't really make sense to me. Who was at the tomb, when Jesus was resurrecting. I don't really like I it's kind of an unpopular opinion, but I kind of come from the position that I don't even really think Jesus may have existed at all.
You're a mythicist.
I'm on the fence still about it. Um, but I've heard some pretty good arguments on mythicist side, and I just don't really see a reason to believe. I talked to Bart Ehrman and David Fitzgerald. David Fitzgerald I had on my show a couple times. I met him in person a couple times. I got all of his books. I love David Fitzgerald. He's a great guy, by the way. But yeah, I just am not really finding anything convincing to believe that Jesus, even as a character, exists at all. But I mean, regardless of that, I mean, regardless if you were to show me evidence right now that Jesus existed, cool, great. I would believe it with you, no problem. Um, now prove that he had superpowers, you know, and that's would be my next thing, is that, okay, you know, that's the main thing that's holding me back, is that, you know, people just don't have superpowers. We talk about Occam's razor, you know, and it's the simpler explanation that Jesus probably didn't have superpowers. He probably was some good magician, you know, told really good stories. People after him who wanted others to become more convinced, told more extraordinary, extravagant, better storytelling descriptions about Jesus, to make him sound more extraordinary. So I don't, you know, the next question would be, is prove that he even had superpowers whatsoever. Because I mean, that's what I would define them as. I would define, you know, being able to feed thousands of people with a loaf of bread and a fish. A superpower, I would say, you know, walking on water, turning water to wine, bringing people back to life, himself back to life, flying. I mean, these are comic book superpowers. So it's like, people don't have those. That's
Well,
Occam's
yeah,
razor.
it would require. Well, Occam's razor is just it. Does it? Are you adding more unnecessary entities than necessary? Right. So that's why I start with theism, because if God exists, then this is not as hard to believe, right? If there's a theistic God that created all of reality, a resurrection is not that hard to believe anymore. Whereas if there's no God, now that's pretty weird. We're
Yeah.
entirely relying on the laws of physics for them to be broken. So that's kind
Right.
of weird. That's why and you had said earlier you think that philosophical arguments, you don't think that that's really evidence. So I want to address two things you said. That, and then before that, you said you spoke with Bart Ehrman.
Mhm.
Now, you know, he's not a mythicist, and he, in fact, debates against mythicists. What did
I
he
would
give
disagree with
you? Well, have you seen his debate with Bob Price?
Yeah, I've seen his debates with Bob Price, but I mean, he has plenty of literature talking about Jesus not having a whole lot of evidence to back up his existence. Again, I've talked with David Fitzgerald, who is like besties with Bart Ehrman. He confirmed on my podcast, he actually confirmed that Bart Ehrman is in fact a mythicist, and it's actually a big misconception. But
Really?
he is in fact a mythicist.
So Bart Ehrman is now a mythicist.
He always has been. Well,
Why did he
you know,
debate
since birth.
Bob Price against being a mythicist?
I didn't see it, so I couldn't tell you.
Well, yeah, he debated Bob Price, who is so there are only I don't know what Fitzgerald's background is. Is he a historian or
I'm
classicist
surprised
or
that you're familiar with Bart Ehrman, but you're not with David Fitzgerald. I'm
I'm
surprised.
not familiar with his education, like what he
Okay.
actually does. I know who he
Yeah,
is.
I don't remember like a lot of his education. I know a lot of it has to do, he was, if I'm not mistaken, I could be getting this wrong, but he was going to school to actually be a pastor, started deconstructing from there. I don't know his
Well,
whole
I
life
remember
story, you
that.
know, but yeah, you should go look him up some more. He's got some pretty interesting arguments. He actually was just here in Michigan for probably 2 or 3 months ago. And we actually walked in the University of Michigan. They have some really, really old biblical manuscripts, like very old Hebrew texts and everything. And he actually came and we did like a tour around, and he like talked about the manuscripts and stuff. And then he came over to Roseville, Michigan. He did like a speech over there about his new book that he just came out with called Playing God. And yeah, you should check him out.
Okay.
He's got a lot of good stuff.
I've looked up a little bit about him before. I've seen him in discussions. I probably should have just watched. I saw the podcast you had with him, or the video you had like 12,000 views,
Mhm.
which is not bad. That alone will get your channel monetized on YouTube.
Right, right.
But so, I, but Bart Ehrman specifically debated against Bob Price. So Bob Price and Richard Carrier are the two actual like historians and biblical scholars or scholars of antiquity that take the mythicist position that I'm aware of. I
Okay.
don't know if Fitzgerald is an antiquity historian or anything like that, but they're the only two that I know of. And Bart Ehrman debated him like in the positive for Jesus's existence, saying he's wrong for being a mythicist, and actually majority just relied on Paul. Just that like this, why would this man go do all this for a fictional character? Why would all this happen for a fictional character? Like at least posit a human being to pretend to be that liar or lunatic, like C.S. Lewis says.
Yeah. I mean, it's possible that he could have been a liar or a lunatic. I mean, there's plenty of people like, you know, that I've
Well,
talked to
that's
on
the
my podcast
trilemma,
who've,
right?
you know, built entire careers on, let's be honest, being a lunatic. You know, it's writing about Bigfoot is actually God. Like the God that we talk about, you know, Ishmael, like that is God. like that or that is Bigfoot. Bigfoot is actually God. He's been here the whole time. These are actual arguments that people have put up on my podcast, and it's like, why would I believe Paul over these people? They seem like they have pretty good personal experiences.
Well, so before I get to that, let me address the initial point I wanted to address along with the Bart
Yeah.
Ehrman thing was the philosophical arguments. Because I think that philosophical arguments, if the premises are backed by evidence, right? Whether it's like through logic, math, science, we have reasons to believe that the premises are true. But my favorite argument and what's most convincing to me is that it's probably the most common one you've heard is the Kalam, the cosmological argument. Now, I think that William Lane Craig, who's the most popular proponent of that, he could do better at defending it. He says things that aren't true. Like he says the majority of physicists think the universe began to exist. That's not true. Nowadays, a lot of physicists are drawing models to try to explain the universe in an eternal cyclical way of some sort. And so like you shouldn't do that. But that aside, I still think that that argument works very well. And I think that most of the attempts to attack the first premise, definitely, I just think it's wild to go in that direction. The second premise, I'm happy to defend. So like if with the Kalam, right? Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. What's your problem with that argument? Excuse me, if any.
Yeah. So I don't see the necessity for a God is where it's kind of, what it comes down to is like, as far as any, like if we're looking at the Kalam or, really plug into any argument in their philosophical argument in there, I don't see a necessity for a God. Like we could say, cool, we could go with that premise that everything, that has a start has to have a starter per se. How do we know it's not aliens? How it comes down to, I don't see a necessity for what you would define as a God for what I have seen and experienced and learned about as far as like the Big Bang or whatever it may be. Or evolution. I don't see the necessity for a God to start this.
But
I feel
you
like
think
it's perfectly reasonable that things could start coincidentally or as an effect of something else happening over the process of many, many, many years, lots of time. I'm not seeing a necessity for a God.
But you do agree with the argument. The argument just necessitates that there's a cause.
I think that's a slippery slope. Again, let me just preface, by the way, I'm not a good philosophy guy. I'm not really good with the whole philosophy. It's definitely an area of growth that I need to work on. But I don't know if I would entirely, I guess, define a cause.
Just an event of some sort that leads to an effect.
I mean, I guess if that's the definition that you're giving, I could agree with it.
Right. The Kalam alone doesn't, like, you have to extrapolate from the Kalam and argue to get to God. Like, you don't just get to say the universe has a cause, therefore God. Like, no, but that would be silly. That's God of the gaps. But I think that's the start for me. So if there is a cause to the beginning of space, time, and matter, that would mean that whatever that cause is has to be capable of existing outside of the universe. And so then we can ponder what that is. Now, so like if you, from a naturalist perspective, if the universe begins to exist, see, and that's the thing too, like you've accepted the second premise now, so you think you're going to accept that the universe began to exist. Just from like your personal intuitive position, do you think that the universe began to exist, or do you think we live in an infinite universe?
Again, that's one I'm not really sure if I have a solid answer, and I'm not an astrophysicist.
Well, just intuitively, like if you first think about it.
I'm really not sure. I genuinely can't say for sure. It could be infinite. It could have a, I think that the best argument that's presented at the moment is that we all came from a singularity. I think that's the best presented argument. Again, not an astrophysicist, so I can't elaborate super in depth about that at the moment. But yeah, so I'm not really sure. I think that there's good arguments for both sides.
Okay. To me, that would be like, that's the first question I ask myself. I've I've deconstructed and reconstructed different forms of thinking of, did the universe begin to exist or not, for several years now. I've
Mhm.
stayed up late just thinking, how does this work? Because that to me is one of the biggest questions. Like, why does anything exist at all rather than not? And so I think if we establish there's a cause, and I think actually both, if there is or is not a cause, if the universe is eternal, I think it's still better explained by God. Are you familiar with Bayesian reasoning at all? Bayesian.
No, no, I'm
Okay.
not familiar.
So there's Bayesian probability, and then there's frequentism, which is, frequentism is just, well, if this event happens this many times, let's say I flip a coin 10 times, and 6 times lands on heads, 4 times lands on tails. From frequentism probability perspective, it's more likely to land on heads again. Let's say for whatever reason, the way they made the coin, there's a slight weight distribution that allows heads to land more from flicking it at the
Mhm.
same speed. But then there's Bayesian probability, which is what you use, and I think works better for events that we don't have a frequent amount of events or occurrences to measure probability. So, like for example, there's a philosopher named Richard Swinburne. He makes a Bayesian argument for the resurrection. And there's a couple other people that do that too. And because, like, when we use, you were saying earlier, how, well, what's more likely the case? Like, we don't see resurrections every day. We've never seen this. It's more likely from a frequentism perspective
Mhm.
that somebody faked it. Some alternate naturalistic explanation. But the problem is, if we're going to truly observe this from a frequentism perspective, we have to look at the entire picture. So that means, how many times was there an instance where someone claimed to resurrect, but then created the movement of Christianity? Right. So we have to include the whole picture. So we have one instance. So now frequentism's kind of out the window. We don't have anything else to observe outside of this, because nothing has been like it. Like, you have to factor in the entire
Mhm.
picture. And so when you have one-offs, then you extrapolate philosophically, for lack of a better term. So, like, with the back with the cause and effect principle, I think the principle of causality is true. It's more likely that if something begins to exist, there is a cause, right? The effect would be the expanse. But even because if you have an infinite universe, let's say this guy Roger Penrose, very famous astrophysicist or um, cosmologist, he has like this model that's an infinite loop, kind of, sort of, where do you know the second law of thermodynamics, for
I don't
entropy?
know it by heart, no, but
Okay,
but I
just
know of it. I'm aware.
okay. So entropy is just things going into disarray, energy becoming unusable, right? And so think of like an hourglass, a shape like this,
Mhm.
but infinitely. And
Yep,
that's what he thinks our universe is. And when it's going back this way, it's reverse entropy. So we go this direction until we start to run
I
out of
gotcha.
usable energy. And so instead of heat death, we start reverse entropying and then get back to a point and then start over again. But what this does is, this now adds an infinite amount of causes for this beginning of the entropy and then reverse entropy, infinitely. And so now we have an infinite amount of explanations, as opposed to one if the universe just began to exist, rather than an infinite universe. So that's one reason why I think we're more likely to see a universe that began to exist. And then I think that physical things are causally contingent. And because physical things are causally contingent, the universe is a physical thing. It consists of matter and energy. So the universe is most likely causally contingent. I know I've spurred off a lot. What are your thoughts?
Um, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot of thoughts.
Okay.
It yeah, it was a lot that you said just now, but, um,
I'm sorry, man.
yeah, no, you're good. I'm not a philosophy guy. I literally don't do this. I don't do philosophy stuff. I specifically say it on my lives too. I'm like, look, guys, I'm not talking philosophy. Like, 'cause I just don't do it. I took philosophy in college and failed miserably. Um, yeah, no. Again, I'm just not seeing how that equates. Therefore, the Christian God. I guess bottom line
Oh,
is,
there's a lot of work to do to
um,
get to the Christian God.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying is that like I haven't seen the math add up. I haven't seen Christians haven't
Okay.
shown their work, I guess you could say, or even Muslims or Hindus or whatever. Nobody has shown their work. They have the premises, they have the arguments, and they have their conclusion, but they don't show their work in between. And that's where it's kind of losing me. Like I don't have evidence of ancient Jewish guys rising from the dead other than what the Bible says. I don't have any reason to believe that. So it's like, cool. A lot of what you said was good stuff. Understood probably half of it, but
Well, I can,
I just have a lot.
yeah.
I have a lot of work to do on my end, but
Well, I'll try to veer away from the philosophical stuff. I try to, and forgive me, and Peter here in the comments says hard to wrap his brain around that. So if you're not a philosophy guy, maybe that was not the best approach. Okay, so let's try another route. I do suggest that you study philosophy. The best atheist philosopher to me is Graham Oppy. I think he's brilliant.
okay, I've heard of him.
He and William Lane Craig have several discussions online. Although I don't think William Lane Craig is the best Christian philosopher, that's just one of the guys that will converse with him, and they're able to have a good discussion.
Mhm.
And you can kind of see like the best of both worlds, for lack of a better term. So you can hear both sides. I love watching debates because then I can hear the best of both sides. But even more so than like a formal public debate, Capturing Christianity is a YouTube channel, and they have more like discussions like this, where they'll just present a paper that they did, and then the atheist will argue against the theist, and they'll give like very intellectually sound reasons why they take, and then you can really ponder like, wow, that's a really good argument against this. And
Yeah,
that's
for
if
sure.
you want to get into philosophy, because I don't think we should reject philosophy. That's this modern notion, and Christians do this too. There's this verse where Paul says, be wary of philosophies, and he's specifically talking about like paganism and stuff like that. But Christians try to say, well, that means don't do philosophy. Well, in order to use logic, that's a branch of philosophy. So unless
Yeah.
you just want to go around saying there are square circles or marry bachelors, you need to use philosophy to a certain
Yeah, no,
extent.
I totally agree with you. Yeah, like I'm definitely gonna look at if you could send me those names
Yeah,
after this too. Yeah, if you could send me those, and that way I can look into it.
I'd be happy
Yeah,
to.
I've got my legwork. I'm a lazy guy, man. I really need to pick up my game on the whole philosophy arguments and stuff. But yeah, I do agree with you that we can't just throw philosophy completely out the window. I would never say that. Because you got in my opinion, every everything that we've said today starts with some sort of philosophical argument or position, so
Right.
um you have to start with it. So to throw it out again, like you said, you can't come up with a square circle type of thing. So yeah, I think that we definitely need philosophy, but to use it purely as justification for the existence of a god, or to have the argument and the conclusion, but to not have the work to in between, that's where it gets a little bit of a slippery slope for me.
Well, so your premises have to be backed by evidence. So, like, if I were to just make a weird syllogism, because you can have deductively valid arguments that are not logically
Yeah,
sound. Like if I were to say Socrates is Greek is a language, therefore Socrates is a language. Right? It's a deductively valid argument, but
yeah,
obviously Socrates is not a language. So that's
exactly.
if you have arguments that where the premises are backed by evidence, which I think like the one I gave does have evidence to back it. Again, we just went over the basic kalam, so that's just a cause argument. I think we have good reason to believe that there are philosophers who disagree and there are some who agree. But I think that because remember now, uh, if God exists, right, he's going to be a metaphysical being. And so science alone is not going to be enough. Just like there are other truths of the universe that we can't discover through science
Yeah.
and through empirical data. And either way, I showed you why empiricism is a little off in the beginning. But we can get away from that topic because that's not really your
Yeah,
thing.
I
That's
would
cool.
pause you for 1 minute. You said
Yeah.
that, so where you said God, if God exists, he's a metaphysical being.
Hmm.
Um, I guess I might pause you on that. I don't know if I would
Sure.
totally, because again, I think it would just come down to a definitions game. Like one thing, someone may define God as not being a metaphysical being, but being, a physical being that's tangible in reality, right? But So it's a very small thing, but I think I would disagree
Mhm.
with you on a little bit that that God would again necessarily have to be a metaphysical being.
Well, I guess what would we do, like, because if God is the cause of the beginning of reality, at least physical reality, there's no space, there's no matter, there's no time, at least no physical time. Maybe there's like some other form of non-metric time or a cosmic time of some sort where change can occur, but as far as there's no physical reality for a physical being to exist. So if God does exist and he's the explanation for reality, he would have to transcend the physical. And so that's why physical just means non metaphysical just means not physical. That doesn't mean he doesn't have that, because obviously if Jesus is God, which Christians believe, then he would have to have the capability of interacting with the physical and even becoming physical,
Mhm.
like with Jesus. But I think if God exists, at least in the Christian perspective, he would have to be, at least initially, metaphysical.
I got you.
Does that make more sense?
That makes a little sense. Yeah.
Okay. So let's go to scripture, because it seems like a lot of your skepticism comes from being skeptical of the Bible, like if it's trustworthy, right?
Mhm.
So what's the historical criterion that has to be met for you in order for it to be trustworthy, or at least somewhat reliable?
I would say I would say independent resources is a big thing for me. You know, like when we look at King Nebuchadnezzar, right? Like I don't doubt that King Nebuchadnezzar was a real person because we have a lot of external independent documentation that he was a real person. We have archaeological evidence, um, personal testimony, personal testimonies from people of the time, etc., to corroborate that King Nebuchadnezzar was a real person. But then you look at the claims in which he was eating grass for multiple years on end because he thought he was a cow. Do I believe that happened? No, because there's not a single documentation of him eating grass for years on end on his hands and knees like he's a cattle. There is not a single documentation of him doing this, and he was apparently, according to the Bible, doing it for years on end. And so, like, it's little things like that. You look at even Elisha and the two she bears from 2 Kings 2:23 through 26, where Elisha is walking to Bethel and there's a bunch of kids that come out of Jericho and they're making fun of him for being bald, and he curses them in the name of God, and then two giant bears suddenly come out of the forest and maul all 42 of these kids. And not a single one of these people, their parents, the surviving children, not a single one wrote this down that this happened. Like, hey, me and my friends were mauled by two bears after we called this dude Baldy. You know, like that isn't like a thing that we found. So it's like we don't have any external documentation for a lot of these things. So that's a big contention for me. Is just the Bible's the claim for me. It's not the evidence. So it's like the Bible saying a thing, and there not being any thing to corroborate that actually happening outside of the Bible saying it is no different than Harry Potter saying that Voldemort loves me.
Okay. So I guess I didn't really hear. So when you say you need external, so you just need some additional documentation.
Yeah,
Because, like,
and
in history, we're not going to get any. The best thing, at least from a historian's perspective, the best thing that they find is eyewitness testimony. That's like the first thing that they look for. And then following, there will be other sets of data,
Mhm.
archaeological evidence, things of that sort. So we don't really have, for the Old Testament, we obviously don't have firsthand eyewitness accounts of, at least other than the author talking about Elisha, right, and the attack of the bears. Same with Nebuchadnezzar, right? We just have that scriptural account. I think that's in Daniel.
I think so.
So in regards to the Gospels, though, well, let's go back in this direction.
Mhm.
If you need to have independent verification outside of the Bible, I think, like the Gospels, for example, do you just put them all into one and say that's just the Bible? You don't consider them four separate documents or four
Um,
separate writings?
yeah, I would say the Bible is everything. It's from page 1 to page whatever it ends at. You know, that is the Bible. You know, regardless of the Old Testament, New Testament, the Old Testament makes up 77.3% of the of the Bible's entirety. So to like throw out three quarters of the Bible is just wild to me. when
Well, I'm not
Christians will
suggesting to
say that
throw it
it's
out
the
though.
Old Testament. But as far as the Gospels, the oldest known Gospel that we have is, I think it's Mark, if I'm not mistaken. But
Currently, that's the
yeah,
consensus.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's like from around like 60 to 70 CE, I think is what the oldest manuscript dates back to. I could be wrong on that, so don't quote
No,
me on
no, we don't have
that.
manuscripts that old,
Okay,
unfortunately.
all right. So whatever. Disregard. I thought they were around that age, but maybe I'm thinking of
That's
something else.
the book of Mark
Um,
is dated. The late dating is going to be around 70 AD. Early dating is going to go
okay,
to
yeah,
the 40s, 50s AD.
gotcha.
So,
I was close, but
but I'm just saying, like
yeah.
manuscript wise, our oldest or our newest manuscript, or oldest, what am I talking about? Is actually I think still P52, the John Rylands fragment, which is 125 AD.
Mhm.
Okay. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, I would say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are separate books. They're separate writings. They're not all the same. They've been put into one book. And I would never discard the Old Testament. So I don't know if you thought I was saying that. I was
No, no,
just,
no.
okay. Um, in the Gospels, like for example, if we're going to try to look at the events of Christ, or at least start with his existence and then move on to all the claims, right? We have four separate writings. Two of them would be claimed to be direct eyewitnesses. So does that is your skepticism more you're just going to throw them all together and be like, this is just the Bible, or is it you just don't think that they are written by eyewitnesses?
Yeah, I definitely don't think that they are written by eyewitnesses. I don't have any reason to think that they are written by eyewitnesses.
Okay.
And Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all essentially just retellings of the same story, and then John is kind of corroborating those tellings. So it's like, to look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as like all separate documents, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me when they're all kind of saying the same exact thing, just kind of talking about each other, talking about the gospel previous. It's not, I wouldn't consider that like corroborative, especially as like, again, the things that are in this Bible are only in the Bible, they're not independent of anywhere else outside of the Bible.
Yeah, but we do have extra biblical claims, like of Christ, of a crucifixion, of the followers of Christ, from like Tacitus,
Oof.
from Josephus, and we don't even have to include like the Christian claimed afterward Christian writings, Pliny the Younger. We have claims of this
I
person,
would disagree with
Christos.
all of those people who's I've talked about like Pliny the Younger and Josephus and Tacitus. All those people were born, lived, and died well after Jesus would have.
Yeah, they weren't eyewitnesses, but I'm
Oh,
saying that they're
so it's like,
they
who cares what they said?
well they they're
You know?
they're outside sources to attest to these claims being made at that time.
But would that not be the same thing as me saying something about like JFK or something?
That
Like
would be
how
similar.
why
And
believe
JFK, I would think, is
why believe what I said about JFK?
well, if you were the only person, that would be one thing. But if, let's say, there were four gospels written about JFK, and then we have an outside source, Calvin, that wasn't alive during the time of JFK, but was alive during the time of his followers, right? Let's say there was a JFK following from the assassination attempt, or not attempt, real assassination,
Yeah.
and and there was a whole movement, right? And you wrote about it. You wrote just a snippet of it in a historical book you were writing that had nothing to do with that specifically, but you had to mention it because it was relevant to Dallas, Texas at that time, right? So that would corroborate that there's validity to this figure historically. That alone is not sufficient, but that's only helpful. It's not harmful.
I would still disagree with that it's corroborative. It's like, regardless of like me attesting to the things that um JFK may have done, said, etc., or talked, certain people he may have talked to. I wasn't there during the time, so it's like, why believe what I say? Regardless of whether I'm attesting to the things that are already previously written about him, who cares what I have to say if I literally didn't even exist during the time of them? So it's like, that's why I don't really care about Josephus or Tacitus or any of those people, because none of those people were, they weren't even born yet. If we go back to the chronology of the Bible and the lineages and stuff, we
Right.
can map out that those people couldn't have been alive during the time of Jesus if he existed. So it's like, who cares
But
what
if
they
if they're
say?
corroborating like stuff that happened with the followers, with the disciples and apostles of Christ,
I
right?
say
Which
people, lots of crazy people believe lots of crazy things, and they can pass that for generations. A guy like that's like a guy approaching me and saying that he knew JFK. He's like, I
mhm.
know JFK, and these are the things that he said and did, and I just believe it. And then write down what he said to me, and I'm just not that gullible.
Well, but I think we're like assuming that skepticism, you should be skeptical in things that you take to be truth. I agree, right? We should weigh them out. But I think that if we actually like measure what we find to be what we call historical truths, right? Things that we would say about Julius Caesar or about Plato or some historical figure, I think a lot of times we're not consistent with the metric we hold those folks as opposed to Christ in the stories in the
But
gospels.
I agree. I do agree that sometimes we don't hold the same contention, but it's like I don't know if I even believe that's the things that Joseph or Julius Caesar said. Like, how do I know that? Like, I am skeptical about that. Honestly, it's like when they say Julius Caesar said this, I'm like, well, how do you know that? you know,
Okay.
who told you this? Like, where's the corroborative evidence for that? So it's like I'm kind of on the fence where I'm a little bit more skeptical about that. But yeah, at the same time, these people aren't claiming to like be God, and to have, again, back to the magic superpowers. They're not claiming to have magic superpowers, not claiming, believe in me, or these really terrible things could happen to you, or you could at the very least experience a separation from God. Those people aren't saying those things. They're not making these extraordinary claims. So I don't really need the extraordinary evidence to back up the fact that Julius Caesar said that he likes ham sandwiches. But
Okay.
I do need corroborative evidence to believe that Jesus said that he is God.
So let's run with that. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The Sagan claim. What do you mean by extraordinary evidence?
I don't know, but if God exists and he wants me to know that he exists and he loves me, he knows what that evidence would be. And he either hasn't given it to me yet, doesn't want to give it to me, doesn't have the power to give it to me, or does not exist.
So see, that seems to me to be an unfalsifiable position.
Okay.
You don't think so? I mean, like it seems
I don't
at
really think
least
so. It's like my honest answer is I don't know what would convince me of these things, but if God exists and he loves me as much as Christianity claims that he does and wants me to be with him,
Mhm.
he knows what that evidence would be and exactly what would convince me.
So it, when you say I don't know,
Mhm.
is it possible there's no evidence that could convince you?
It is possible, but I like to think that I'm an open-minded person and I'm totally willing to change my position. Like if you were to show me evidence right now, convince me even that God exists, I'll still say that he's a jerk and I don't want to follow him, and I still would continue to do what I'm doing today. I would believe in him, but I still would fight against the things that he says, does, advocates for, etc. I just wouldn't want to follow it.
Okay, so there's more going on there. Then you have a moral issue
Yeah,
with.
also God's
Okay,
a jerk.
okay. So you
Like
have
if
a
he
moral
exists
contention
if
with
he
God.
exists, so like
Okay.
that was kind of the forefront, is that, I started to deconstruct, and like my first read through of the Bible, I read it from cover to cover multiple times. The first time I read it, I started reading it as a Christian, who believed in conspiracy theories also. And by the end of it, I said, I don't know if this God exists, but if he does, I don't really like him that much. And then it just kind of built on from there. Read the Bible a couple more times, started to look at it, more in depth, and eventually just came down to this God is a jerk, and he also more than likely doesn't exist. So just like how Voldemort's a jerk, but he doesn't exist. It's the same thing.
Okay, gotcha. So and then when you say he's a jerk, I'm assuming we're taking, particularly in the Old Testament, a lot of the very tough passages, things to do with
Slavery,
like
genocide,
exterminating, claiming.
incest,
Yeah.
rape.
Okay. So
Yeah.
the I guess, and you're not into philosophy, so I can't get into the ethics piece. But I think when it comes to, are you into ethics at all? Have you like taken a side in ethics
Um,
or?
I mean, I guess you can go into it, and if I've got something I can add, I can add it in there. But
Well, I guess the first question would be: do you think that there is moral truths, or I guess the standard question is: do you think morality is subjective or objective?
So this is where I'm still, even to this day, kind of flip-flopping on this.
Mhm.
I'm still working my way through it. I would say at this moment, what I've been going with is that I think morality is subjective. The same things that, what I may consider a good or bad action, someone on the other side of the country might not, or you may think differently. And I don't think that there's any objective right or wrong way to do this. Like, I base my subjective moral standards, moral compass on well-being, on do unto others what I would want done to me. So like, I'm going to treat others the way I want to be treated. Like, I wouldn't want harm to come to me. I wouldn't want to unalive myself. I wouldn't want to unalive other people. So I think that that's the I guess you could say, the objectively, from my subjective standpoint, that's the objectively moral standpoint, is to just not unalive people.
Okay, so your you say that morality is subjective, or what philosophers say is stance dependent. It's dependent on your stance. So, where does that come from? Does that come from your psyche? Does it come from a mixture of your psyche and your cultural upbringing?
Yeah, I would say, yeah. I mean, I would say that. I would say it's a mix of, your, brain development and how you develop, and the society and culture that you're born and raised in. My family raised me to have the moral compass that unaliving people is wrong, that hurting people is wrong, calling people names is wrong, um, etc. So that's what I'm based off of. But again, I could grow up in a different country, a different state, whatever, and my family could raise me to, that unaliving people is the good thing to do.
Right.
So I mean, it's subjective.
Okay. So, I would disagree, but I would. This is I'm a moral realist. But before even getting to that, we don't have to go to that. At least not in this stream, because that would take a long time. But if that's true, let's say your position is true. My challenge to you would be, well, if that is true, that would mean you grew up in a country that was based in Western values, which are going to largely be based off of Christianity and Judaism. The entire Western culture, like throughout its inception into the Middle Ages, into the Enlightenment to today, is heavily based in Christian values. A book I would recommend if you like
Mm.
reading is Dominion by Tom Holland. This book, are you familiar with that book by any chance? No?
I feel like I've heard of it, but
It's a very, very popular book. And Tom Holland's a historian, and he was challenged by a Muslim after he wrote his book critiquing Islam on, well, why do you have the beliefs that you have? And he didn't know. And so he wrote this book. He studied the history of the West, and he came to the realization that Christianity has a large input on our values today. Like a lot of things that we take for granted today, pre-Christian influence in the West were not considered to be immoral. So if this is the case, this would mean that your judgment that you use to condemn God comes from Christianity largely. So we don't have to get into that too deep, because I know you're
yeah.
not into philosophy that much, but that to me is a struggle. Like I when I read Old Testament passages that seem morally troubling, and I think a lot of them aren't as troubling as they may appear to be, but the ones that may appear to be, especially first glance, right? I think about that. I'm like, what? Okay, well, how I'm I'm using God to judge God. Well, that would mean
I
we have
guess
a
the thing
reasoning
is
issue
that I'm
there.
not really using God to judge God. Like, again, I come from not a super Christian household, although, like, great, our values may be based on Christianity. Cool, great. Um, but bottom line is that those beliefs, they're nothing exclusive to Christianity. Like, those, moral standpoints existed well before Christianity was ever around. So it's like, how can we say that Christianity wasn't basing its moral compass off of an earlier faith or religion?
Well,
Um,
that's because it was
or
radically different, though. Like,
exactly.
so, for example, when Paul goes and the famous phrase, "There are no males nor females, nor slaves nor masters, no Jews nor Gentiles. We are all one in Christ." They looked at him like he was a lunatic, because this was not normal. The Greeks were based off of Aristotelian philosophy, which was that women and men are not equal. Some people are born to be slaves. Some people are born to be masters. And your coming into the world and experience tells you whether you should or shouldn't be a master, or shouldn't be a slave. And then, of course, same for the Jews, thinking, "What? We're one with the Gentiles? No way!" And that continues throughout the Scripture. But there are things that we don't even think. Just equality between male and female. This is going to come from Western values. This didn't exist pre-Christianity. For example, we talk about abortions today
Mhm.
in late Rome. So like third, and this actually happened pre, but this is when it started. So Saint Macrina, who was the sister of Gregory of Nyssa and Basil the Great. So this is 4th century. She was the first person to start saving babies from being aborted. Now, abortions then were not like they are now, where they pull them out before they're born. This was after birth. So you had a baby, you don't want the baby, they would just leave them out on the front porch to die or to have wolves or something else come up and eat, right? Great people in Rome. So Macrina started this organization, and she's actually a female saint. Not a lot of people know there are female saints. You got to give them their props. This
Oh yeah.
woman started an organization and started saving little babies. It was awesome. And these are things that just were norms that we don't think about today. We think obviously you would save a baby if you see a baby on the set, but 1600 years ago, you would just see babies, dead baby. That's crazy. And so again, we don't have to go too deep into this part because we're already an hour in, but I challenge you to think that, because if you say that this is the truth about morality, you have inherent views of moral values and duties that are from your culture that come from Christianity, whether you realize that or not. And
I
that's
just
why I
don't
would
see why
recommend
it
reading this book.
matters. I guess that's the bottom line. Is I don't see why it matters, like whether my moral compass is based off of, at some point based off of because again, growing up, it very much was like, the whole God Jesus thing was very much on the back burner. I was so there's a lot of finger waving type of thing. So like that's why it doesn't really make sense to me, because sure, maybe my grandma beat my mother, into believing, but
Well, that would be horrible if that's true.
it totally happened. But
Oh,
I'm not seeing how that trickles down to. I guess I'm confused as to how that would
so
like equate to anything. I guess
let
I'm
me
just
try
not
to
seeing why it matters.
lay it out a little better, because like the example you just described
Mm.
would not be an example of like something that's taught in Christianity. Obviously, you have to choose Christ. You can't be beaten into choosing Christ. God knows your heart. So if you come to Christ from that, that's a horrible way to come to Christ. But I guess it's possible. But I'm more thinking of just values that we hold today that were not the case pre-Christianity and pre the West. Now, this does not mean that the West is superior to the East from a value perspective, because there are lots of problems with the West. Don't get me
But that's
wrong.
the thing, is that I think that there was plenty of cultures that weren't, aborting babies and that aspect of leaving them out for the wolves or whatever. Like there's plenty of societies during the time, even before Christianity was around or even Judaism, that didn't leave babies out in the cold, and
Well,
they
that's
didn't
just
have
an
a Christian
example.
belief system. Well, I know, but it's like if we look at really any moral conundrum, there's plenty of cultures pre-Christianity that weren't doing these things, or we're doing one thing over the other. So I'm just not equating how like all of our moral compass is based off of specifically a Christian moral compass, when Christian moral compasses were based off of earlier religions and cultures
But
before that.
that's the thing, though, is the reason that the New Testament spread so rapidly the way it did, and the way Paul was able to get his point across and people remembered it, is because it was so radical. So back to what I was saying about the Gospels and why I think they're reliable. There, if you can meet like 3 methods of professional historical criterion, you have good reason to think that these documents are true. And this is not like uncommon amongst historians. And so I think that the Gospels meet at least 5. Multiple attestation, the principle of congruity, the principle of embarrassment, the principle of dissimilarity, and then what was that? Coherence, right? And so dissimilarity would be the one principle in particular, right? even though there are prophecies in the Old Testament that I think lead to Christ, I think that the idea, at least from the writings in the Talmud and then from other writings that we have, Jewish writings, they thought that the Messiah was going to come wipe out Rome. So they were like, "What? You're not wiping out Rome. That's part of the
Mhm.
reason why the authorities didn't like Christ. So you're not doing what we thought you were going to do, what we've been telling people you're going to do. So it's not you." This is a dissimilar story. And then a resurrection is also dissimilar. They were not expecting not only for our Messiah to not wipe out Rome, but to be killed by Rome. And then, by the way, we don't have to say unalive. We're not on TikTok, so we can say normal words to a certain extent. Um, but so it's totally radically different than what the narrative was at the time. And so this, for somebody to make this up, it would make no sense. Like they'd get no value from making this up. And so I think this actually adds to the credit of it being more likely to be true. And then so also dissimilar to the culture, the entire Sermon on the Mount.
Mhm.
Don't look at a woman or with lust, or else you're an adulterer. That women were objects in all cultures back then. I don't know any ancient culture from antiquity or prior where women were looked at equal to men, other than maybe a queen. But other than that, you're going to have women who are
I would
ultimately going
encourage
to.
you to look more into Hinduism, because Hinduism, I've read the Bhagavad Gita a little bit, and actually talks all right about women. To be honest, it really says that you should treat women just as you would treat any man. Don't disrespect them. Treat them as any human type of thing. So I would encourage you to look into Hinduism, because Bhagavad Gita, blatantly says that women are people too, and you
But
should treat them as your fellow man.
even in their culture today, in Hindu culture, that's not the reality. Women don't have the power men have. So are you saying like that was the case then, and then that changed?
I can't say for sure if that's the case, if that was the case at the time. Again, I'm just going
Okay.
off of what the Bhagavad Gita says. The Bhagavad Gita says that you should treat, fellow women, or women as your fellow man. Um, and I would argue, so it's like I guess I'm not really seeing where the difference is, I guess. But
Well, I'm saying if they don't do it now, it's a lot less likely that they did it then when the rest of the world wasn't doing it. Now, all of the West at least has to legally protect women as in the same case as men. And then usually from like a social perspective, in the West you'll see at least like chivalry, things like that. You open the door for a woman, you try to say less vulgar things around a woman. Women are just kind of treated if anything, higher than men to certain extents than as opposed to in Eastern culture, where like in Muslim countries, women can't even speak to a man they're not married to. They can't uncover their face. Like obviously they have less rights. Like you have women who escape to other countries nearby because they want more rights. In Hindu countries, it's very. I have a lot of like Indian people that I'm close with, and Pakistani people I'm close with that are Hindu, and it's the woman does not have the same rights as the man. The man is the head and makes all the rules. The woman is to be respected, but does not have the same power and authority that the man has.
mm,
And this is also like from a legal perspective as well. But um, again, I guess it's possible it could be the other way around, but it seems to me that that's not how the culture was globally then. And it certainly isn't like that now, regardless of what the Bhagavad Gita, which I do need to read that, by the way. You and a couple of other people have mentioned that to me. I really do need to read the Bhagavad Gita.
yeah, it's a
Um,
pretty quick read. Honestly, it took me like 2 or 3 days to read it. Just sitting down with it. It's not like a hard read or anything, so you should check it out.
yeah, I'm gonna have to do that, and one day when I do, I'll follow up with you on that because I'd like to talk to somebody about it rather than just read
Yeah,
it
for
to
sure. I
myself.
actually have I did my last interview that I did on my show. I talked to a Sikh. He
Oh,
practices
okay.
Sikhism and stuff. That was a super interesting conversation too. You should go listen to that one too. 'Cause it was like I learned a lot from him that I wasn't like aware of, because Sikhism is kind of like a branch off of Hinduism.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
really interesting stuff.
Okay. Well, listen, I know we've hit our time. We've actually went a little past our time. I don't see that we have any questions in the chat. So, is there any last points that you wanted to make? By the way, if you guys haven't, I did put Calvin's information in the description. I put your link tree. I imagine that
Thanks.
takes you to everything. Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Yep. That's everything. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, not really any last words. I guess just really, first of all, is like, I appreciate you having me on first and foremost. It was a great talk,
Yeah.
you know, sometime you'll have to catch me on TikTok live and, we can have a talk over there too. I'm working on setting up a YouTube channel. I do have a YouTube channel from my podcast that I've kind of converted over to like my own thing. You can still listen to all my podcast episodes and watch most of them over there. Like the video ones, obviously the interviews are all over there. So you can go check out my interview with David Fitzgerald, and also Anthony Magnabosco I had on there, the executive director of Straight Epistemology International. Talked to him for a little bit. Super interesting, but yeah, nothing really extra to add. I appreciate you having me on, and yeah, just stay skeptical. Anyone who's watching out there is just, keep thinking.
All righty. Well, Calvin, thank you so much for joining. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. You've had a good conversation, I think. So with that, we'll go ahead and end transmission here. Thank you to all who've been watching.
For sure.
Hopefully we'll have you back on and discuss further things. But
Absolutely.
otherwise,
I appreciate
yeah,
everyone watching too.
absolutely. Have a great evening. Thanks for tuning in to Truth Over Tea.